So welcome to the very first live and in-person recording of Beyond Belief. My name is Adam Jacobs, and I'm the senior editor of the project of Beyond Belief, which also includes interviews such as the one we're about to have. And it gives me enormous pleasure, in this case, to be speaking with Dr. Jim Tucker, who has joined us all the way from the University of Virginia, where he works. He is the head of the Division of Perceptual Studies. And in order to frame, first of all, welcome. Welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Of course.
In order to frame, I have a series of questions that I'd like to ask you that I'm sure everybody is also interested in. And to frame it, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my science education when I was growing up, which I think is probably common. At first, I learned from Copernicus that the Earth is not particularly special as a place. I later learned from Darwin, and I get with the caveat that what I was taught is not necessarily what these people actually said, that we're just fancy apes. Then Freud came along and said, you know, most of what you think is pretty lowly and base, which isn't so inspiring. There was an experiment done by Miller and Urey in which they concluded that because some lightning hit a pond millions of years ago and life began. And I believe that, I accepted that totally because that's what I was taught in my 10th grade biology class. And finally, even in modern times, Richard Dawkins has basically taught us that all a human being is basically some genes that are trying to perpetuate themselves. So what we have is a pretty depressing picture of what humans are, our place in the universe, and what awaits us. Okay. Then, later in life, I discovered your work, the work of your division, and others like you, and for the first time was able to perceive that there are real scientists out there who are doing work that challenges some of this, what I would call radical physicalist's paradigm of the way that the world is. I know there's a long and rich history of the department, but I wonder, for the sake of the crowd and the virtual audience, can you give us just a few sentences on what you do and how it came about?
Sure. So at the University of Virginia, the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry way back in the late 1950s became intrigued by a phenomenon of young children in various parts of the world who said they remembered a past life. And he started investigating these cases and got more and more intrigued. He eventually stepped down as chair of the department to focus on this work full time, not just with the children's past life memories, but other work as well. And the work has still been going. So he started this small research division in 1967, which we now call the Division of Perceptual Studies. And we've now studied over 2,500 cases of children who report memories of a past life. Ian Stevenson, who started this work, typically went to places where he could find the cases, which was places with a belief in reincarnation, like India, Thailand, and so forth. These days, we don't have to find the cases because they find us. So with the internet, we hear from over 100 American families a year telling us about their child reporting the memory of a past life. So our work becomes trying to assess what to make of this phenomenon. So is there evidence in this phenomenon that would suggest that these memories have carried over and that memories and mind can continue after the body dies? So what we try to do is, if a child talks a lot about a past life, we make a record of it, and we try to see, does that match somebody who actually lived in the past? And in the strongest cases, and you're going to, with our special guest star, hear about one in a few minutes, we see that there is strong evidence that a child does have memories that came from a past life. Our division also looks at other ways of approaching this question of can consciousness survive after the body dies. So Bruce Grayson is one of the world's leading experts on near-death experiences, and we also have a research lab that looks at people trying to do various psychic tasks, ESP tasks, trying to sort out what the brain is doing while the mind is trying to do these exceptional things. So that's some of what we do in our division.
Yeah, and I was fortunate enough to pay a visit a couple of months ago, so I got to see firsthand what you do, and it's extremely impressive. And I think that if people saw, how serious it is in terms of its research, I think they would be taken aback and pleasantly surprised that there is another story out there. So in thinking about the skepticism that I know exists, in the world about this, I went all the way back to Carl Sagan, who's, extremely well known. He wrote a book called The Demon Haunted World in 1996, and he said the following thing. He said, at the time of this writing, there are 3 claims in the parapsychology field which, in my opinion, deserve serious study, with the third being that young people sometimes report details of a previous life which upon checking turn out to be accurate and which they could not have known about in any other way than reincarnation. So that's pretty wild that he would be open to that to begin with, considering who he was.
Right. Well, and the book, The Demon Haunted World, was essentially an argument against anything sort of paranormal or spiritual, and really was a physicalist kind of thing. But he had enough of an open mind to say sometimes things don't fit the way we think they do, and it's worth exploring, and this was one of the items he mentioned.
So the thing I wanted to ask you was, what do you think he would say at this point, given it's been 30 years? Do you think that the research would be convincing to him? You think he would have changed his mind about his perception of the universe?
Well, I can't say I could read his mind, but there are plenty of people where it does make them stop and think. So we hear from people in various scientific fields who are leading very mainstream careers, but are also open to these things. And you never know who's going to be open to it, partly because of their own personal experiences, but also reading Ian Stevenson's work or reading some of our more recent work and deciding, wow, this means something and it's worth looking into.
Right. I think that my perception is that people are becoming more open to it. I could be wrong. I think, as we've discussed actually in the past, I think it needs to reach a much broader audience, and I'm hoping to help with this and other means to bring that about. But taking a step back, could you explain this phenomena in any other way besides, he says it has to be reincarnation. Is there any other phenomena that could explain this? Could it be ESP, clairvoyance? Could these people be tapping into some, as it's called, the Akashic field, that there's this field of consciousness out there? Or would you say that there's evidence that it specifically must be reincarnation?
Well, that's sort of a complicated question to explore. So first of all, there's the question of, do you accept that these cases are valid? And reasonable people can differ on that. I think we can now say we have good evidence that some children do have memories from a past life. So then the question becomes, okay, how do we interpret that? And you're right, the most straightforward solution is that they have memories from a past life because they lived that past life. But there are other possibilities, and I think if there is this realm of consciousness which is connected to the physical world but also separate from it, it may well be too complex for us to fully understand. Yes, I mean, you mentioned ESP or Akashic record or whatever. I think, as you'll see in a few minutes, on an individual level, that explanation doesn't make sense, because in these cases, you see a child who is very emotionally attached to these memories, which are as strong as any memories that they have or will ever have. I mean, they are extremely intense. They are not just repeating facts from a life, but the perspective from somebody who lived and died, which includes the attachments and love they had for other people. So it certainly seems to be that in one way or another they lived that life in the past. Now, it doesn't mean it's the same personality, and we all know that personality comes from our genes and our environment and various things, but that there is also this larger piece that may experience being a personality in one life and then experience being a different personality in another life.
Right.
But there is this continuation.
And getting a little philosophical for a second, to these children, and we should emphasize that it's very unlikely that a 2 or 3-year-old is going to start coming up with all these details of someone else's life in some other place. It just seems so counterintuitive, and that's part of the reason I assume that you study kids. It's so unbiased. But do they ever talk about what happens in between these two lives? And I'm also curious to know if they ever say what it means. Why are they being reincarnated?
Well, about 20% of them do talk about events between lives. And it varies. Some of them will talk about staying near where the previous person died or where the previous family is. They may talk about remembering the funeral of themselves. Others talk about going to another realm like heaven. Some of the American kids will use the word heaven. For others, it's not entirely pleasant what they go this other realm. There may be various longings or hardships or so forth. And then some of them will talk about preparing to come back. And some say they had a choice of who to come back to. Others say not. And then some will describe seeing, quote unquote, seeing their parents and choosing them and seeing things that they did that the parents then confirmed that in fact they did do before the child was born.
Which seems pretty hard to predict. It's hard to make that up.
Right.
There's an interesting phenomena which seems, again, so unlikely and so counterintuitive, that there are birthmarks on kids that correspond to specific wounds that the deceased in their previous life had. And I know from your book that Dr. Stevenson quoted the Nobel Prize winning physiologist Charles Richet, I think it's how you pronounce it, who said, "I never said that this was possible, I only said that it was true." And then Dr. Stevenson went on to say, he put the odds of 2 birthmarks randomly appearing in the same places on another person who was wounded there, and of course who claims to have memories of being that person, at 1 in 25,000.
Right. So, yeah, Ian spent years studying these cases where the children didn't just report memories, but also were born with birthmarks or defects that matched ones from the previous person. 18 cases where the children were born with 2 birthmarks, ones that matched the entrance wound and the exit wound on the body of a gunshot victim. And there are some pretty wild stories. And yes, it does seem counterintuitive. And initially, it was hard for me actually to accept this aspect of the phenomenon. So how I make sense of it, and more or less how Ian did, was that it's a phenomenon of consciousness, that it's not literally the wound on the previous body, but more the previous person's awareness of that wound sort of scarred their consciousness, and then it shows up when the consciousness then enters a new body. That wound then manifests as a similar wound or defect on the body of the developing baby.
And how do you feel about it now?
I think some of these cases are very hard to dismiss, even though, it's a bit of a stretch to think that a hole in one body from a gun then shows up as a scar on the next one. But we, as Thomas Jefferson said, we try to follow the evidence wherever it leads, and that's where it leads sometimes.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you've seen them with your own eyes.
Sure. Yeah.
So, couple more questions, and then we have special guests coming right up, of people who have actually gone through this experience and that you've worked with over many years. Would you say that this is a purely scientific area of research, or does it also veer into philosophy? In other words, is this the classical model of testable and falsifiable that people require for scientific standards, or is it more of an inference from observations that we make?
Well, it's certainly not controlled laboratory experiments. There are a lot of ways to try to find out truth and a lot of scientific ways of doing it. And some of them involve exploring spontaneous phenomena that cannot be controlled. And this would be one of those. But we certainly use, or try to use, a scientific mindset as we approach these cases. So we don't, it's not philosophical in the sense that we accept what people tell us and then make inferences about what it means for all of us. I mean, we're in the nitty-gritty trying to verify each statement that the child has made, making sure that the child said it, and then making sure it connects with the past life. And so it's we think, a very serious-minded approach to this phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, would you say, I read this online a couple of days ago, actually someone wrote something on something that I had written, and he wrote to me, "There is no evidence for the supernatural, why not admit it?"
Recording in progress.
Okay.
Can we get you to say that line again? We'll edit that out.
Yeah. So someone said to me online, "There is no evidence for the supernatural, why not admit it?" So is this evidence of the supernatural? Is this breaking into a new realm of scientific discovery? One of your colleagues told me that he views Ian Stevenson as the next Darwin, who's going to be discovered someday, and this will be considered as much of a breakthrough as any other major discovery that's ever taken place. It's just not there yet. Would you agree with that? Is that where it's going?
Well, as far as evidence of the supernatural, first of all, I would say this is not supernatural. It's natural. We just don't understand it. And there's plenty of evidence that mind can operate separate from the brain. So when someone says there's no evidence for something, it means they don't know of the evidence. But this person was incorrect.
Okay, good. I want to let him know. Okay, so we're going to take a second for a little transition, and I'm going to ask Cindy and Ryan Hammond to join us now. So we'll need another chair, and we need to get Ryan on Zoom, who is joining us from Oklahoma.
Ryan's going to be bigger than life.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi. Are we rolling again?
Let's wait 1 second.
Okay.
For cameras to reset.
Okay.
And that should be a water phone.
Can you move the screen to face us?
Let's angle the screen a little bit towards the audience so they can see it. And tuck in that cable.
Angle it more. Can we angle it a little bit more? So the whole group can see.
It's okay with me.
Ryan, everyone's wanting to get a good look at that.
A reincarnated person right here.
Yeah.
Rolling?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. So welcome, Ryan and Cindy. It's great to have you guys here. And obviously, your perspectives on this whole thing, it's one thing for us to to discuss this in this abstract way, but it's quite another to hear from people who actually lived it. And I have read your story several times, including last night. From my perspective, it is just remarkable and very hard to explain. And therefore, it seemed like a great opportunity to showcase to everybody here and watching online, exactly the meaning of what transpires when someone, as a young child, starts to report these memories. So I figured to start off, Cindy, can you tell us what happened? When did this start?
Ryan was in pre-K, and he started having extreme nightmares. Every night he would wake up screaming, saying his chest hurt. He was 9 years old before he ever slept through an entire night. So I couldn't figure out why he kept having these night terrors. I took him to the doctor. They couldn't really explain it. Sometimes it happens to children. And then one day he just opened up to me and he said, "Mom, I have something I need to tell you. I think I used to be somebody else." So the first story he ever told was, I had 3 boys. They weren't my boys, but I gave them my name. And so it was very odd, and he wanted to know what happened to the boys. And he started talking about having lived in Hollywood with a house full of children and his swimming pool and working for the agency. And so after he told me the first story, I started researching a little bit about reincarnation. And I had read that if you went and found books from the places the child talked about, then it would help kind of give them some closure. Because I never dreamed we would be able to ever pinpoint who the person was that he talked about, because Ryan's memories weren't like, my name's Joe Brown, or it's more like, I hated cats. Let me tell you why I hated cats. Or he would tell you a story about one of his wives, and he had 4. So he would start talking about one of his wives, and it was just very intricate details, like I drove a green car, or part of my address had the word rock in it. So I kept it a secret from my husband for quite some time because he was the son of a Church of Christ preacher. This wasn't something that we were taught to believe in. And I knew that Kevin wasn't going to be exactly accepting of it, but how to figure out a way to get my child to sleep through the night. So I started researching and found that Dr. Tucker was very reputable in the field, and it said that if he agreed to speak with you, you had to be open to him visiting you in your home. And I knew there was no way I was going to pull that off and my husband not know that there was a renowned child psychiatrist in my home. So I had to tell Kevin my little secret, and so we started researching it together, and I wrote a letter to Dr. Tucker, wrote one letter, and gave him all the details I had. But before I actually sent him the letter, I had started going to our public library, and I would get books on everywhere Ryan talked about, because it was so extensive. He would talk about dancing on the stages of Broadway. He would talk about going to Paris with his wife on the big boats. He would talk about how his sister had been a famous dancer. He just had all of these different places that he would talk about that he had never been to and he had never been exposed to. Not a child that's watching cartoons isn't going to know these details. There would be days that maybe there would be a certain type of music that would come on the TV, and he would do a complete tap dance in front of the TV. And I'd say, "Ryan, where did you learn that?" "Well, I used to do it all the time with me and the guys." And he would tell you just all kinds of stories, and they would be funny stories, some of them. But there were nights that it was like you were living with an elderly person that had Alzheimer's, and he was grieving because he couldn't remember what were my children's names, what happened to my mother that had the curly hair. And one of the stories that he had told us was, I had 2 sisters. One was 3 years older and one was 3 years younger. And whenever the census records came back, he was right. He was correct. One was 3 years younger and one was 3 years older. And Marty Martin's own daughter did not know about the other aunt because she had died at 21 of pneumonia.
Marty was the person he was previously.
Marty was the person he was previously.
Right.
So Ryan's case, according to Dr. Tucker, is kind of unprecedented because we were flipping through a book about Hollywood one night, and I would have books sent in from other libraries. You know, when we exhausted what we had in our library, I had them sent in from other places. So we had brought in this big book from the library, and Ryan's flipping through it, and those are the nights he would sleep, as if he could kind of look at the pictures and tell his stories. And all of a sudden he came across an old black and white photo, and it was from the movie called Night After Night, 1932. And so he grabbed it and he said, Mama, Mama, that's me and that's George. And we done a picture together. And so, of course, there was nothing on there other than it had George Raft's name, but it didn't have the other gentleman's name. And so I started immediately researching everything I could find out about that movie, and there wasn't hardly anything online about it.
It's an old movie.
Most of the actors in it were uncredited, and the man never spoke a word. So it seemed really unlikely that an extra in a movie had had this grand life that he talked about running an agency and doing all of this travel. And, you know, he would get mad some days and he'd be like, I don't like being little. When I was big, I used to go down and see my boys at the bank, and they gave me the money, and I went where I wanted to go. Why can't we fly to have Chinese food in Chinatown? You know, we would go into a department store for school clothes shopping, and there was one lady that she didn't like it that Ryan kept going over and touching the suits and the ties because he was little. She got onto him, and he wanted agent clothes. I mean, there were times we have to buy him suits and different things because he wanted to dress like he had when he had been Marty. And she got onto him and told him he couldn't touch the suits. And he turned around and looked at her and said, Lady, do you know who I am? If you mess with me, you won't work in this town again. So you just never knew when it was going to pop up because it was like this whole other personality. He would go from being a 5, 6-year-old little boy to this Hollywood mogul that I just can't stand living here. Where are our servants? Do you know how much easier your life would be if we had a butler? And we would just laugh and, you know, kind of go on with it. But he would be just really mad about it because he just couldn't stand the fact that he had been a rich Jewish man who had been a Republican, and he came back to a middle-class family. Mom worked at the local county clerk's office. Dad was a police officer. I worked for an elected Democratic official, which that was just horrible to him because he wanted to be a Republican. And his grandfather was a Church of Christ preacher. So his whole life was just turned upside down. So everything that we tried to teach him, he would fight you on it, especially when it came to religion. He would have questions. And it was really difficult.
Brian, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can.
So, do you recall any of this that your mom is talking about at this point?
Well, I mean, if you really want to think about it like this, I mean, think about when you were 3 years old. Can you, I mean, you can't really remember
No,
anything.
I don't remember anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the exact same thing. I don't know if Dr. Tucker talked about this because I only heard some of the audio, but in these kinds of cases that I will just refer to as reincarnation, um, most of the children forget by the time they are about the age of 9, I believe. And so, you know, none of these like incidences, I guess you can say, I don't remember whatsoever. Um, a common question I get a lot when they ask about this is, do you remember anything? And I have to say no, because I really don't. I don't remember anything about this. A lot of times I say that this wasn't my story. It's more my mother's story because she tells it more than I can because she lived through it, of course, you know, lived through everything. If that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. But do you have any like residual positive feelings about Hollywood or movies or like?
Okay, I will say I don't want to be a Republican anymore. You know, so especially after watching the State of the Union address that just happened. You know, I do have a fondness, I guess you can say, for actors in Hollywood and you know that kind of realm of stuff. If you know, black and white movies, one of my favorite things to watch. You know, when I'm just get bored or I'm bored or whatever, and just studying that side of old Hollywood and just studying history around that time. You know, World War II, around that. You know, living in that era. I mean, there's a fondness to it, I guess you could say. And I believe that parts of my personality do come from that era. Not that era, but the other person, we'll just say right now. Parts of my personality. And again, it's hard to explain, but you know.
Yeah. Uh, do you do you accept that it happened to you, or do you think that there's some other explanation?
So I try to think about it scientifically. A scientist doesn't just take an answer by its word. If that, I accept that it happened. I accept that something happened. I won't say it's reincarnation. I won't say it's possession or something like that, or ESP or whatever. I won't say it's that because I'm not sure. Just like everybody, just like even Dr. Tucker, we're not sure. So I mean, I accept that some event that we cannot explain happened to me, and that's all I can say.
And Ryan, yeah. Sorry, if I can ask you a question. It's great to see you again.
That's good. Well, I wish I could see you, but
Right. So I've talked with some adults who said that even though they didn't remember that they ever remembered a past life even, but just knowing about it, hearing the stories helped them have sort of more of a spiritual outlook on their life. Any of that with you? I mean, knowing everything that you and your parents went through, do you think it shapes the perspective that you have?
to me, I personally don't know. I am agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have any type of religious viewpoint on anything in my life.
Mm.
It's possible that could be shaped by my experience going through this, um, because I feel like if I didn't go through this experience, I would probably go through a Christian upbringing, just like all my peers in a small town Oklahoma setting. If I never met, any of the people that got me to where I'm at today, my whole worldview would be completely different, you know? So I believe that it made me more curious as to what could possibly be out there. What could this thing that happened to me be? And that's something that I don't think we will ever answer. I think it will probably be an enigma just because we can't put, I mean, we can put a label on it as reincarnation, but truly to me, I believe that we don't have a word for what happened, if that makes sense. And we just use the word reincarnation because it's the easiest thing for our brain to understand.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple more questions, and then we're going to take some audience questions as well. So, Cindy, how did this change you? Also, I'm curious if was it a positive or a negative experience when you were going through it, or both?
It was very negative when I was going through it because we lived in the Bible Belt. People were very mean to me about it, especially after it had been on TV. People had a lot of questions. I worked in a public office. There were a lot of mean questions directed toward me. My husband, who is deceased now, he had a completely different experience with it. The people that he worked with would go buy books on the subject, and they were more open to it. So I just kind of think it depended on what kind of atmosphere you were in. I seemed to work in a more religious atmosphere. Like the people that I had worked with had been more of a Christian-based faith maybe. But we just had a very different, flip side of the coin of how it affected me versus how it affected Kevin. And I think we tried to shield Ryan quite a bit from it. It was something that we were very careful about. Any kind of talk show that we did, we didn't do anything that was not something that went through Dr. Tucker first. If somebody approached us, we had no desire for 15 minutes of fame. That was nothing that we have not profited from this. That's the other question everybody wants to know. Well, did you profit from this? We didn't profit from this. Actually, almost every time we did anything, it was money out of our own pocket by the time, They might pay for your plane ticket or whatever, but by the time, you know, the rest of it, travel's expensive. And our thing is that at the end of the day, I know what I went through as a mother, and there wasn't a lot of resources out there. I wouldn't have made it through it without Dr. Tucker, because he was so good about when I had questions, he would answer them. But when you're going on no sleep, no understanding, and like I said, you know, he had been brought up where his father had been raised in a Church of Christ. So it caused a lot of problems within our marriage and our family at the time. That was very hard because Kevin's outlook was on it, and I hate to say that because he's not here to speak for himself, but Kevin's outlook on it was, Cindy, tell him to stop talking about it. And my outlook was on it, Kevin worked at night. Kevin wasn't at home whenever I would be up dealing with it 3 or 4 hours at a time with Brian screaming and crying. There was a whole different, I always said it was kind of like we watched the same movie, except for I read the book first, watched the movie, and Kevin kept getting up to go get popcorn. And that's kind of how I always kind of explained it to people,
Right.
is that he got bits and pieces of it, but he never got the closeness that Ryan and I have from it. Because it was something that he and I, basically, we had to go through together. Because it was every story he told, I would write the story down the next morning. I would email it to Dr. Tucker, and we would save it, because we knew that someday, and I knew without a doubt, I prayed every day, God, let us find this picture, and on the back, let it have the man's name and the movie, Night After Night. And when they filmed for The Unexplained, and they hired a lady to go into the Paramount archives to actually research the movie, we didn't get to see The Unexplained before it aired. We watched it with everybody else in America. So whenever she flipped the picture over of Marty Martin, she said, and there it was. And it had his name and the movie on it. And I gasped with everybody else, because it was exactly how I prayed every day. Because I had to solve it, not only for me, but it had to be solved for him. And I still have like broken pieces of it, like things that we never really, and it's been since, I mean, he's a freshman in college now. But there are still pieces that are still kind of missing that I wish we had answers to, and we'll probably never be able to know the answers to them, because there were so many little details that he knew. And there was one that Dr. Tucker would not give me credit for. And it bothered me, because he used to tell this story about his wives. And he said, the one that I love the most, she got married in a skirt and blouse. And he would talk about her, and he would always say, yeah, I went to get her, and I would say, I'm in if you're in. And it was his favorite story to tell. And so Dr. Tucker said, no, I can't give that to you, because everybody got married in a dress, everything they could find, but there was one that was missing. And when we filmed for Netflix, his niece brought the family pictures out that had the sisters that he had talked about, and the mom with the curly hair. And she pulled out one picture, the niece did, and it was a wedding photo, and she was in a skirt and blouse. And that had bothered me, because I just knew that he was telling the truth, but he couldn't get credit for it because we didn't have proof from the photo. And when she laid that down, I knew that was another thing that he was going to get credit for, because he'd told that story so many times.
Well, Cindy and Ryan, just from my perspective, just so you should know, my reaction to your story, having gone over it a few times, honestly, I would say the word that comes into my head is rejoice. Like, to me, it is tremendously inspiring that, and Dr. Tucker's sort of midwifing of the story, and many other stories like it into the world, to provide credible, well-researched scientific evidence over the course of decades. And I have stood in the archive room in the University of Virginia, this department, and I've seen case after case after case is nothing short of extraordinary to me, and I think should give people an incredible sense of hope, you know, that the way that I was taught about the physical world is not necessarily all that is, and therefore maybe we can be a lot happier that it's not going to end in the worst and the most negative way possible. But I wanted to give you the last word before taking questions. in your opinion, you've been doing this for decades. You worked for one of the top researchers in this field and had a close relationship with him. What do you conclude at this moment? Where are you holding with all of it?
Well, I guess I would say sort of where Ryan is, in the sense that, yes, this happens. And we can call it reincarnation. That's actually not a term I prefer because it has a lot of connotations that may not apply. But this is an example of how elements of consciousness, we have very good evidence that they have continued after somebody died and then have shown up in another person. And of course, that can be very hard to go through as a family, but it's great that Ryan and Cindy have been willing, and Kevin when he was with us, that they've been willing to tell this story because it does make an impact. Initially, when we first talked about doing the first TV thing, Kevin and Cindy were very hesitant, but Ryan basically insisted on it because he said, if you won't do it, it shows you're embarrassed about it.
Yeah, you're
so
embarrassed
that's
of me.
how the family came
So
into
we
the
did it.
spotlight. And it's
We
it's
agreed to
great
do it
that
in
you-
shadow, and he threw a fit and said, "If that just means you're embarrassed of me." And the one thing someone had asked earlier about something that had been said about why you come back. Ryan, when he was little, he would tell you why he came back. At one time, Marty Martin owned the most expensive car in the world. It was a Rolls Royce, and we got to see it at the Peterson Car Museum. And it was even inscripted when you open the door. It says, specially made for Marty and Margaret Martin on the door. And they were so gracious to allow him to sit in the car. And it had a tortoiseshell umbrella in there, which we all laughed because when he was little, he would cry for his tortoiseshell sunglasses. And apparently they were a match set. So we found the umbrella, but nobody has the sunglasses. But Ryan would always say he had to come back because of greed. That everybody has a certain lesson that they didn't learn. And that if you didn't learn it this time, then when you come back, you have to learn it. And that was always his lesson, was greed. To always make sure that you're generous and you help other people. And that you don't want to get to heaven. He always said there was a scale of 1 to 10. And you don't want to get to heaven and find out you're just a 5 and you could have done better. So I think it has changed the way I look at the world around me. And I think a lot of times, I think I had been a very judgmental person. And when you go through something like this with a child and your deepest, darkest secret is on, national television, and you're on the Today Show or Dr. Oz, it really makes you realize that sometimes people go through things you can't explain. And just because you didn't have that experience doesn't mean that it doesn't make it true. So I think it made me have more compassion. It really changed me on the level of wanting to be more giving, wanting to be more compassionate. And if someone starts talking about something I don't believe in, I just listen to them, and then I just go on with my day because I don't know what they went through that put them to that point.
I want to thank all three of you for being here, and it was really remarkable. Your story is remarkable, your work is remarkable, and I'd like to open it up now to the audience to ask some questions.
We're just going to call on a couple people, and if I can, we have questions. Henry, Marcelo, you want to come here? You guys can come here. Just come stand right here. Okay, now we have a nice line. Would like to line up. Line up.
Hi, Dr. Tucker. How are you? My question is, you're focusing on children, but do you find that, in your research you come across cases with adults? There's a lot. I mean, I've heard of, adults doing certain types of therapy, if it's hypnosis, where they're able to connect with a previous life. Is this something that people are looking into? Is it valid? Is there some validity?
Well, certainly people have looked into it, and hypnotic regression, some people find quite useful. We're actually rather skeptical about it because hypnosis, it can produce, even for memories of this life, can produce some amazing hits, but also a lot of times the mind just kind of fills in the blanks, and then you can't tell if that was an actual memory or if your mind created it. So when you're talking about a past life, typically an unverifiable past life, you know, in ancient Rome or whatever, I think there's reason to, it may be therapeutic for people, but I think there's reason to doubt that most of the time that people are actually recalling a past life.
And then one other question for you, for you guys, is there a community, like when you were going through this, is there a group, like when you have this type of experience as a kid or as a mom, people you can reach out to who are experiencing similar things?
Not really, but there should be.
I usually try to stay away from anybody that I didn't already know that I could kind of relate to, unless there were a few different people that Dr. Tucker would tell about me. And he would ask me first, you know, this mom just needs somebody to talk to. And I've met with several moms, you know, via Facebook or phone calls or whatever. But there's really not, and there's just, you just have to be so careful, kind of like you said about people making comments on there. And there were times that I'd have to really check my temper and just log off and be like, okay, I'm not even going to comment on that, because people could be so mean and so close-minded about it. But it would be great if there were. But I just think that you have to be so careful, because we're talking about small children here. And it's amazing the people that would contact me wanting to do TV shows and different things based on him, that their whole opportunity was to try to exploit him. And as a mother, that's not going to happen. We were very protective of him, that we wanted to be able to help other parents, but not in the point that it hurt our child.
Hi. My question is regarding the research that you've done, where you talked about, you know, verifying the memories that people have and then being able to connect them to someone who had that life. My question is whether you've then been able to do the research in the other direction of, once you have a candidate life that kind of matches up with that memory, being able then to take details from that life and interrogate, I guess it's the child, on, hey, what was that person's birthday? Or what was your, you know, some fact that you have access to that they might not, and if so, is the answers tend to be, I don't know, or tend to be more right than wrong, or is it the kind of thing where kids can't really be asked that sort of thing?
Well, we don't do that. I mean, at times people have wondered if, or criticized particularly Ian Stevenson for asking leading questions, which is sort of, you know, what you're talking about. And, but no, we don't test them. We take what they give us. So it's not. It's almost like trying to remember, and Ryan may correct me, but it's almost like trying to remember the details of a dream, where you get some of it, but some you don't have. And if somebody asks you, well, what day was it, or what was that person's name, I mean, you have no idea. You just have the images, the glimpses of memory in your mind.
But isn't it the case that you sometimes would put out photos in front of the kids?
Well, that's true. Yeah, so
Ryan's
that kind of testing, thank you. Yeah, so lately we've had some, and Ryan was one, but we've had success showing pictures to kids where one of them was from the past life and one was from the other. I mean, sorry, and one of them was not, as a control picture, and asking them which one was from the past life. Now, and we had one kid who was 6 out of 6 on those pictures. But he didn't then go off and give us great details about the things. So again, it was just kind of a flicker of memory, but not where they can give us all kinds of information.
I think that's what's so frustrating too, is that people, if you saw, I don't know if you saw Ryan's folder when you were there, but his case file is this thick. I mean, this went on for years. And people think that my kid just woke up and said, yes, my name was Marty Martin and I hate Christmas because I died on Christmas Day. And then it just came out just like that. And that's not how it works with these kids. It is just like the first story. I had 3 boys. They weren't my boys, but I gave them their name. And then when they matched Marty Martin, he had 3 sons that he had adopted and gave them his name. He couldn't tell you the names of those children. He could tell you about them. He knew one of them liked baseball. He knew there was only one that called him Dad. He would know very intricate details that nobody else could possibly know. But I think that's what used to frustrate me, is that people just really thought that he just woke up one day and said, I was Marty Martin and I was born in blah, 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 and my mom was, you know, this or that. And you had to just, you couldn't lead him in any kind of question. You just had to take whatever he said. Like when he said, my address had the word rock in it. The man lived on Roxbury Drive. We didn't know that until we found where he had lived before, but that's all we had to do was just take little bitty pieces of it, because it doesn't. I don't think I've. Have you ever had one that just knew their full name?
I don't think so, actually.
And that's just that was what would frustrate me, is that people just thought that this was just so simple, or that I just looked up a movie on the internet, and at the time there wasn't anything on that movie because the people had been dead for so long. And Ryan even picked out one of the actors and said, that's my cowboy friend, he did cigarette commercials. And when we researched it, sure enough, one of the guys in there had been a guy named Wild Bill Elliott that did cigarette commercials and had a horse that did tricks, just like Ryan said. And this movie was about a boxer. It had nothing to do with a Western. And there was no way he could have known that at 5 years old.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a time for like 2 or 3 more, so let's see how much we can do before we run out of time.
So you have done a ton of very comprehensive research. What do you think would be practical benefits of all this research in the future?
Well, I hope in some small way it helps people to feel that we're connected more than we're aware, that there's this consciousness, or you may say spiritual kind of peace that we have that is separate really from just our physical being and physical life, and that we all have it, and we're all connected in that way. So it also at times does provide hope to people who have lost loved ones, you know, to see that there is evidence that there can be this continuation on after we die.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Hi. Just curious, is there a connection between mental health issues and this phenomenon?
Well, we've looked at that some. We've done psychological testing with some of the kids, and the one thing that stands out from testing is they tend to be very intelligent and very verbal as young kids. But otherwise, they seem psychologically normal. And then we've also followed some into adulthood. We've recontacted them and found that, you know, some of them have dealt with issues of depression or anxiety, but typically, I mean, they're high-functioning people just like everybody else.
And is there a danger in thinking these things are real?
Well, I think it's important not to get too wrapped up in it. That, you know, there's some parents who get very invested in particularly the idea that their child is a famous person, and that can lead to some challenges. So hopefully what people take away from this work helps them focus more on their current life, not get stuck on trying to figure out who they were in the past life. So yes, there could be a danger of that. With some of the cases that Ian Stevenson studied in Asia, there were, most of the kids, like Ryan said, forget by the time they're school age, but there's some that didn't, and the families would interact, they'd get too attached to the people from the past life in a way that made it difficult for them to move on with their own lives.
Right. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
How many are left? How many people? 3? Okay. We'll do it fast. You guys are last.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. I'm just curious if you have heard these things talked about, like for example, Elon Musk and lots of people talk about how we are either in a virtual reality now, or if we're not in a virtual reality some hundreds of years from now, then we have a problem. Is this part of a discussion? Because we don't have a right name for it. Is there a discussion of like the Matrix or a virtual reality or being created somehow to experience this?
Well, I think that That's sort of a whole nother topic, but yes, I mean, as Max Planck, the founder of quantum theory, said, he believed that consciousness was fundamental and that physical matter was derived from consciousness. And I think there are good reasons to think that, involving quantum theory and a lot of other things, that mind is the core of reality and that the physical world grows out of that. So yeah, the Matrix is not unlike the movie The Matrix. And, you know, information may be at the core. So yeah, I mean, virtual reality is sort of another way of talking about the same concepts. That this physical world is not the end all, and may be to some extent something we experience with our minds, but doesn't exist outside of our minds.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk, and Ryan, particularly, I appreciated everything you had to say, and you're wonderfully articulate. I just have a very quick question. I'm somewhat observant in my Judaism, and you hear from rabbis over the years, and I'm a victim of that reincarnation, or as they call it in Judaism, Gilgulim, which means rolling, which is a term you find actually in the Bible, and the place where the children of Israel landed was a place called Gilgul, which is where they returned to the Promised Land. And my question is very simple. You kind of hit it on the nail on the head, Cynthia. Is that the rabbis say that they never deny this reincarnation aspect, but you're given reincarnation in order, just as you said, to come back and fix. The word in Hebrew is tikkun. You've come back to fix something that you left open in that past life. And I don't mean to put you, Ron, on the spot on this, and where this comes out. And you know, my question isn't necessarily specific, but how does one look to that type of, given that knowledge, how does that one type of thing look to you from your perspective, in terms of what is it that Martin, you know, may have left undone in his life, in order for you, who's the current incarnation, to come back and fix. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot like that.
It's no problem, sir. You know, I'm trying to articulate this in my mind, of course. To me, it's not really something that was left undone, like something that he just didn't get to do. It was the things that he did in his life that were not necessarily good, if that makes any sense. You know, wrong decisions that were made from different stories that were told by me as a young child, especially topics such as greed and lust, and just how to take away from these experiences and try to learn to be a better person. You know, try to be an 8 or a 10, or, you know, as the scale is put for my mother. So, you know, not really anything left undone, just the stuff that could have been done better.
Very good. Last but not least.
Oh, I wish I had a British accent. You know, when I read Brian Weiss's book in 1988, Many Masters, Many Lives, I said, I have to fix things. I don't want to come back, do school again, pimples, dating. But my question is actually coming from a different movie, Little Buddha, which Bertolucci did in '93, in which, and that's a question that you didn't address, a topic, looking forward. A scientific method talks testability, falsibility, and also predictability. And that movie, just to remind people don't know, the Dalai Lama dies and they're looking for his reincarnation. And they find 3 kids and they go through it. So Dr. Tucker, can we go forward? Meaning, do we take a database of people who were shot or died or this, and then we look for people who may, in other words, not looking backwards in the rear view mirror. We have always this criticism about statistical evidence. You know, if you take 600 monkeys for 600 years, one of them is going to write Shakespeare, right? But if you look forward, which is the predictability, then it becomes more scientific. I just wonder about this comment, and following what my lady before said about a matrix, are there glitches? Could this be a glitch?
Well, I think as far as predictability, the thing is, coming back with intact memories is not common. I mean, we don't know exactly how uncommon it is, but it's not so prevalent that you could, when somebody dies, you could say, okay, I bet he's going to come back. This child down the road is going to have these memories and say these things. So I don't think it would have any predictive power.
Commenting on this, we can use the media to say such and such people went, are the other people who may dismiss memories or thoughts or may mention it to the mother, and the mother was not going to listen to them. And this is all existing there, but we can actually tap into it. I leave it to you to think it all.
Well, yeah, I'd have to give that some thought. As far as glitches in the matrix, I mean, it does seem at times that sort of the usual process gets short-circuited. That, you know, typically it may be that we all die and then come back here, but we don't usually come back with memories. But if something, particularly many of the children recall a life that ended violently, and it seems that that did kind of produce a glitch where the person came back typically quickly and came back with intact memories.
Can I tell you a story? Shalom Aleichem story?
I think we have to end, but thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for all of you in the live audience. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it. If you are interested in presentations like this and information like this, please go online and visit beyondbelief.blog, where you can subscribe and see all kinds of great information like this and a lot of other stuff. It's been a pleasure being here this evening with all of you. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Ryan.
Love you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
You have to admit, I raised a really good kid.
Oh, I could tell. Sweet and good.
He's a good kid.
He's also become